It started with a whisper. A name, a place, something I wasn't supposed to hear. It came in the middle of an ordinary conversation, just background noise in a crowded room. But the way it was said, low, deliberate, almost careful, made me stop. I should have brushed it off, let it slip away like any other half-heard rumor. But I didn't. Because something about it felt familiar. A memory just out of reach, like a word on the tip of your tongue. I looked around, searching for the source. A man near the bar, leaning in as he spoke. A woman listening, nodding slightly, stirring her drink without looking down. And then, a third person. Silent. Watching. Not me, them. That should have been the moment I walked away. But I didn't. Because in that instant, I knew, this wasn't the first time I'd heard that name. I told myself it was nothing. A coincidence, a trick of memory, something my mind had conjured out of the noise, filling in the blanks where there was nothing to find. I had no reason to believe otherwise. No reason to turn back and listen. But I did. I moved slowly, careful not to seem interested, keeping my eyes elsewhere while my ears strained for the sound of that name again. It didn't come, not right away. What did come was something else, something far worse. The way they spoke, how they carried themselves, it wasn't the words, but the weight behind them. It wasn't just a conversation. It was a transaction, an exchange of knowledge, of understanding, of quiet, deliberate power. The third one, the silent one, never moved. They weren't part of the conversation the way the other two were. They were the observer, the enforcer, the guarantee. I didn't need to see their eyes to know they were aware of everything in the room, the exits, the security cameras, the people who might be listening. People like me. And yet, they didn't stop me. They didn't acknowledge me at all. Not yet. The feeling in my chest wasn't fear, not at first. It was something colder, something that hummed beneath the surface of my skin like a low electric current. Recognition. Not of them, but of what they were. I turned away, forcing myself to walk, to move toward the other end of the room, to pretend I had no interest in them or their conversation. But my mind wouldn't let it go. That name, I had heard it before. And not just anywhere. I had read it. Years ago. A book, an article, something buried in the archives of history, something no one was supposed to find. A name that wasn't supposed to exist. It wasn't famous, not in the way names usually are. It didn't belong to a politician, a billionaire, a CEO. There were no photographs attached to it, no scandals in the tabloids, no mentions in the endless cycle of media. And yet, it had been there. Whispered between the lines of history, hidden in the margins of important moments. A quiet presence, always just out of reach. I had dismissed it then. A ghost, a trick, a mistake. A name without a face. And now, here it was again. Spoken. Alive. The hum beneath my skin turned into something sharper. Not fear, not yet, but an awareness that something had shifted. A door that had been left ajar for years was now wide open, and I had no choice but to step through it. The room was full of movement, people coming and going, voices rising and falling in meaningless conversation. But to me, everything else had faded. The air felt heavier now, thick with something I couldn't quite define. I wasn't looking at them anymore, but I could still feel them. 3 of them. Always 3. I kept walking, past the bar, past the quiet hum of whispered deals and half-truths. My hands felt steady, but my mind was a blur, shifting through memory, through old fragments of information, trying to find where I had seen it before. The name. Their name. Then I found it. A flash of ink on paper. An old report, hidden in the archives, buried beneath layers of bureaucracy. A scandal that never made the headlines. A story that had been cut short before it was told. It wasn't about them, not directly. It was about an event, an unexplained disappearance, a decision made behind closed doors. And there, in the footnotes, was the name. No accusation. No direct involvement. Just a mention. A presence. At the time, I thought nothing of it. A stray detail, a coincidence, a name lost in a sea of other names. But now, standing in this room, feeling the weight of unseen eyes on me, I understood what it meant. They weren't mentioned because they were part of the story. They were mentioned because they were the story. The ones who were always there, just outside the frame, just beyond reach. The ones who made decisions, erased mistakes, rewrote the past before it could become history. And now, they were here. I didn't turn back. I didn't stop moving. But I knew, in that moment, that I had already gone too far. I kept walking, forcing my breath to stay steady, my steps measured, my body language indifferent. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. I wasn't in control anymore. Not really. The moment I recognized the name, the moment I made the connection, something unseen had locked into place. A mechanism I didn't understand, one that had been turning long before I ever stepped into this room. I moved toward the far side of the venue, weaving through the scattered guests, past polished marble, crystal glassware, the murmurs of conversations I no longer heard. The air was cooler here, farther from the heat of the crowd, but I didn't feel relief. The weight was still there, an awareness, a presence that didn't leave. Not them. Me. I wasn't supposed to know. I wasn't supposed to remember. Yet the name kept circling back, pressing into my thoughts like an old scar I had forgotten I had. I could almost see the report now, the yellowed paper, the faded ink, the careful omission of details that should have been there. I had read it once, years ago, when I still believed information was free, that knowledge was something you could simply collect and categorize. Back then, I didn't understand the weight of absence. I didn't question why certain stories had no end, why some events seemed to vanish before they were fully formed. But now, in this moment, I did. Because I had just stumbled upon one. I didn't look back, didn't let my eyes drift toward them, but I knew they hadn't moved. They didn't have to. They had already done enough. A single conversation, a whispered name, a perfectly placed moment in time. That was all it took. I needed air. I slipped through the exit at the far end of the room, past the heavy doors, into the quiet hallway beyond. The space was empty, the noise from the gathering fading behind me, but the silence wasn't comforting. It felt deliberate. I kept moving. A long corridor stretched ahead, lined with dim wall sconces casting a soft, golden glow against dark wood paneling. The kind of place designed to be forgotten, a passage that wasn't meant to be noticed. Yet here I was, moving through it, the sound of my own footsteps muted against the plush carpet. With every step, my mind unraveled more of the memory. The report, the footnote, the carefully placed name. It wasn't tied to a single event, it was scattered, a thread woven through multiple incidents, always in the background, always just a whisper. The fall of a politician, the sudden collapse of a corporation, the inexplicable disappearance of someone whose name should have meant something. Different stories, different timelines, but always the same pattern. And always, somewhere deep in the layers of it all, three figures. Not an organization, not a movement, not a secret society with symbols and rituals. Just three. A constant. A presence. A shadow in the framework of power itself. I reached the end of the corridor, turned a corner, and stopped. Because I wasn't alone. The hallway was empty, no movement, no sound, but someone had been here. Someone who had just left. The air was still, too still, like a room where someone had just finished speaking. A cigarette extinguished a second too soon. A chair that had only just stopped rocking. And then I saw it. A single object, placed perfectly in the center of a small table against the wall. Nothing dramatic, nothing overt. Just enough to be seen. Just enough to be understood. A folded piece of paper. I reached for it before I could stop myself, fingers brushing against the smooth surface, the faint indentation of ink pressed into the page. I already knew what it would say. Not a threat. Not a warning. Just a reminder. I unfolded it. There was no signature, no explanation. Just a single line, written in steady, deliberate handwriting. We were here before you. The hum beneath my skin returned, colder this time. They knew. They had always known. And I had just been invited to remember. As I stood there, the weight of the message pressing into my consciousness, the air around me seemed to thicken. The hallway's dim lighting cast elongated shadows, each one a silent testament to the secrets that had been lurking just beyond my perception. The realization that I had been unknowingly entangled in a web spun by unseen hands sent a shiver down my spine. The name on the paper wasn't just a random moniker, it was a symbol, a representation of influence that operated in the shadows. I recalled the recent headlines about Justin Bieber, the pop sensation whose life had been under relentless scrutiny. Accusations of drug use had surfaced, painting a picture of a star on the brink. Yet, his representatives vehemently denied these claims, attributing his weary appearance to late-night recording sessions and the responsibilities of fatherhood. The public saw a narrative of a troubled artist, but now I wondered, was there more beneath the surface? The entertainment industry was no stranger to manipulation. Careers could be built or dismantled with a whisper, reputations tarnished or restored with a well-placed rumor. The power to control such narratives required more than just wealth, it demanded access, strategy, and an intimate understanding of human nature. The trio I had encountered epitomized this clandestine influence, operating with precision and anonymity. As I delved deeper into my thoughts, connections began to form. The sudden rise and fall of certain celebrities, the inexplicable shifts in public opinion, the scandals that erupted without warning, were these events mere coincidences, or were they orchestrated by an invisible hand? The patterns were subtle, almost imperceptible, but with this newfound awareness, they became glaringly evident. The hallway, once a simple architectural feature, now felt like a passage between realms, the known and the concealed. Each step I had taken down this corridor symbolized a journey deeper into the labyrinth of hidden agendas and covert operations. The message, "We were here before you," wasn't just a statement of precedence, it was a declaration of omnipresence. They had been influencing events long before I became aware, and their reach extended far beyond what I could fathom. The implications were staggering. If they had the power to shape the destinies of public figures like Justin Bieber, what else were they capable of? Political upheavals, economic crises, societal shifts, were these, too, under their purview? The realization that so much of what I perceived as spontaneous or organic might be the result of meticulous planning unsettled me to my core. Yet, amidst the turmoil of these revelations, a question lingered: why had they allowed me to glimpse behind the curtain? Was it a warning, a test, or an invitation? The ambiguity of their intentions gnawed at me, each possibility more disconcerting than the last. In the grand scheme of their operations, I was insignificant, a mere observer. And yet, they had acknowledged my awareness, subtly yet unmistakably. The world outside continued in blissful ignorance, unaware of the puppeteers pulling the strings from the shadows. Public figures like Justin Bieber became pawns in a game far more complex than the tabloids could ever portray. The scandals, the comebacks, the controversies, all pieces on a chessboard manipulated by hands that remained unseen. As I folded the paper and slipped it into my pocket, I knew that my perspective had been irrevocably altered. The challenge now was to navigate this newfound knowledge without drawing further attention, to exist within a reality where the boundaries between truth and manipulation blurred. The trio had cast their die, and the game was in motion. The next move was mine, but the rules were known only to them. With a steadying breath, I turned away from the table and continued down the hallway, each step echoing the silent promise I made to myself, to uncover the extent of their influence, to understand the depth of their reach, and to determine whether I was destined to remain a bystander or become an active participant in this intricate dance of shadows. I stepped back into the main room, the noise of the gathering rushing in to fill the silence I had just left behind. The contrast was stark, almost jarring: laughter, conversation, the clinking of glasses. All of it so normal, so routine, as if the world hadn't just shifted beneath my feet. But that was how it worked, wasn't it? The truth, the real truth, never came with fanfare. It simply existed beneath the surface, woven seamlessly into the fabric of everyday life, invisible to those who didn't know where to look. I scanned the crowd, forcing my expression into something neutral. A skill I had picked up over the years: how to blend, how to observe without being observed. But this time, it felt different. I wasn't just watching anymore. I had been seen. The folded paper in my pocket felt heavier than it should have, its message looping in my mind like a quiet, insistent whisper. "We were here before you." A simple sentence, but its implications ran deep. Not a threat. Not a warning. A fact. They had always been here, operating in the shadows long before I had stumbled onto their existence. That meant they weren't just watching me now. They had been watching me for a while. The thought sent a cold wave through me, but I couldn't afford to let it show. I moved through the room, nodding at familiar faces, exchanging polite smiles. If I acted differently, they would know. I reached the bar, ordered a drink I didn't intend to finish, and leaned against the counter, watching the room the way I always did. This time, however, I was searching for something. Them. And then I saw him. Not the same three from before. Someone else. But the same presence. The same quiet control. A man in a perfectly tailored suit, standing at the edge of the gathering, just outside the circle of conversation. He wasn't talking. He wasn't drinking. He was just there. Watching. He wasn't looking at me, not directly. But I knew he knew I was here. He was the confirmation. The final proof that I had crossed an invisible line. I took a slow breath, forcing my heartbeat to steady. I wasn't in immediate danger, at least, not yet. If they had wanted to make a move, they already would have. No, this wasn't about elimination. This was something else. A game. A test. They were waiting to see what I would do next. I turned away from the man, pretending not to notice him. I had two choices now: walk away, let it go, pretend I had never heard the name, never seen the pattern, never read the message. Or I could follow the thread, pull at the edges of the truth they had so carefully hidden. Both choices came with consequences. I sipped the drink, my mind working through the possibilities. This wasn't just about curiosity anymore. It wasn't just about knowing. It was about understanding how deep this went, how far their influence stretched. If they had been in the background of politics, of Hollywood, of culture itself, then who else had they touched? Who else had they erased? I thought of Justin Bieber again, of the stories in the media, the quiet shifts in his public image. Had they decided his fate too? Was he just another move on their board, another piece repositioned in a game none of us knew we were playing? I set the glass down, untouched. I needed answers. And if they were watching me, then I needed to make my next move carefully. The moment I placed the glass down, I knew it had begun. A small gesture, meaningless to anyone else, but significant to the ones watching. I wasn't walking away. I wasn't pretending not to notice. I had chosen to keep pulling at the thread, and now, they were waiting to see how far I'd go. I moved away from the bar, careful not to look at the man in the tailored suit. If I had learned anything from observing powerful people, it was that the ones with real control never felt the need to assert it. They simply existed, their presence commanding attention without a word. This man, he was a signal. A quiet reminder that they were watching, but also an invitation. I passed through the crowd, pretending to be lost in the movement of the party. Every sound felt louder, every interaction more artificial now that I knew what was behind it all. Conversations were just noise, disguises wrapped in meaningless pleasantries. I wondered how many of these people, wealthy, connected, important, knew they were just pieces on a board someone else was arranging. My mind kept circling back to the name, the message, the patterns I had only just begun to recognize. Justin Bieber's name had been the first to stand out, but I knew it wasn't just him. There were others. Names that had drifted in and out of the public consciousness, stories that had flared up and died out in ways that never felt quite natural. Some celebrities fell from grace overnight, some made sudden, inexplicable comebacks, others simply disappeared, their relevance fading faster than seemed possible. It was all part of something. A system. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. The entertainment industry had always been a machine, churning out stars, scandals, distractions. But what if it wasn't just about entertainment? What if it was something deeper? A mechanism for control. People followed celebrities. They idolized them, mimicked them, absorbed their words and choices without question. If you controlled those figures, you controlled perception. And if you controlled perception, you controlled everything. A cold certainty settled into my chest. The three weren't just background figures in history. They were architects. I reached the far end of the venue, near a side exit that led to the balcony. The night air hit me as soon as I stepped outside, crisp and quiet. The noise of the party faded behind me, and for the first time, I felt the weight of what I had uncovered pressing against my ribs. I wasn't supposed to see this. I wasn't supposed to understand. But I did. And now, they knew that I did. I leaned against the railing, watching the city stretch out below. The skyline flickered with 1,000 lights, 1,000 lives moving forward without ever knowing how much of their reality had been orchestrated. How many of their choices had already been made for them. Behind me, I heard the door click open. I didn't turn. I already knew who it was. The man from the party. The one who had been watching. The one who had been sent to confirm what they already suspected. I could hear his slow, measured footsteps as he approached, stopping just a few feet away. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence alone carried the message. They were ready for my next move. The real question was I? The man stood behind me, his presence as deliberate as everything else that had happened tonight. He wasn't here to force anything, not yet. This was another test. Another step deeper. I kept my hands on the railing, watching the city below. I wasn't going to be the first to speak. If there was one thing I had learned about people in power, it was that they despised silence. It made them uncomfortable, forced them to fill the space. And the moment someone like this spoke, they gave something away. The wind shifted slightly, carrying the distant hum of traffic and the muffled sounds of laughter from the party inside. It felt absurd, knowing that just behind those doors, people were drinking, flirting, sealing business deals, oblivious to the undercurrent of something much larger happening right here, right now. I wasn't afraid. Not yet. But I knew enough to understand that fear wasn't what they wanted from me. Not now. Not yet. A slow inhale behind me, then finally, a movement. Not a word. Not a threat. Just the quiet press of something against the railing beside me. I glanced down. A phone. No brand, no distinguishing features. Just a small, matte black device, resting in the space between us like an offering. Or maybe a command. I let the silence stretch a little longer before reaching for it, careful not to show hesitation. I turned it over in my palm. No lock screen. Just a single open file. A document, nothing more. I exhaled slowly through my nose and tapped it open. A list of names. It took me a moment to register what I was looking at. A series of people, some instantly recognizable, some I had only vaguely heard of. Celebrities. Politicians. Executives. And then I saw Justin Bieber's name again. This time, though, it wasn't attached to a tabloid headline or a quiet scandal. It was next to a date. Not a past date. A future one. The breath I hadn't realized I was holding escaped slowly. I scrolled further, scanning other names. Some of them had checkmarks next to them. Some didn't. Some were highlighted. It wasn't a list. It was a schedule. A carefully planned sequence of events, each name tied to a specific moment in time. Promotions, downfalls, disappearances, resurgences. An orchestrated timeline of influence. I locked my jaw and turned my head slightly, just enough to see the man's profile. His expression was unreadable, his posture relaxed. He wasn't watching the phone. He was watching me. Another test. I closed the document and set the phone back down on the railing, next to his hand. I didn't need to say anything. I had already seen enough. They controlled everything. He picked up the device, slipping it into his pocket with an ease that made it clear he had already known what my reaction would be. Another long silence. Then, finally, his voice, low, even, without any particular inflection. You understand now? Not a question. A statement. I didn't move. Didn't respond. Because, really, what was there to say? I had been given a glimpse behind the curtain, and now, there was no pretending I hadn't seen it. No pretending I didn't know what the next step would be. They had shown me the game. And now, they were waiting to see if I would play. The moment stretched between us, heavy with unspoken implications. The city sprawled out before me, glittering and indifferent, while behind me, the man waited. He had made his move. Now it was my turn. I could feel it, the gravity of what had just happened. There was no undoing it. I had stepped over an invisible line, and whether I wanted to or not, I was now inside the game. The question was what role they expected me to play. I inhaled deeply, steadying myself, and turned to face him. The wind tugged at the edges of my jacket, the only thing between us the cold, unyielding night air. He met my gaze with the same measured calm, neither pressing nor withdrawing. His job was done. He had delivered the message. The phone had been a tool, a window into something few had ever seen. A curated glimpse, not the full picture, just enough to tell me that what I suspected was true. That what I thought I knew about power, control, and influence had only been the surface. That everything was already decided before it ever reached the public. And now I had seen the schedule. The names. The dates. Justin Bieber's, among others. Future events already carved into stone, waiting to unfold. I spoke for the first time, my voice quieter than I expected. What happens if I say no? He didn't blink, didn't shift. He didn't need to. The answer was already in the silence between us. I had been allowed to see this because they wanted me to. If they had wanted me gone, I would have been gone before I ever reached the balcony. If they had wanted me to forget, I would have never remembered in the first place. This wasn't about threats or force. This was recruitment. The realization settled in my chest like a stone. They weren't testing whether I would expose them. They were testing whether I was useful. Because there was no exposing them. Not really. The public only believed what they were allowed to believe, what they were conditioned to accept. Scandals were stage-managed distractions. The fall of a star, the rise of another, all planned, all necessary. They weren't hiding from the world. They were shaping it. I glanced toward the party inside. People with influence, people with power, and yet, none of them had any real control. They moved within the system, not above it. For a brief moment, I imagined walking away. Pretending none of this had happened. Telling myself I had misinterpreted everything, that the paper in my pocket was meaningless, that the list was nothing more than a random coincidence. But the truth was, I had always suspected. And now, I had proof. So there was no walking away. Not really. The man must have seen the shift in my expression, because he nodded once, a subtle acknowledgement that the conversation, the decision, had already been made. I was in. Whether I wanted to be or not. Without another word, he turned and walked back inside, blending into the crowd with practiced ease. Like he had never been there at all. I stood alone on the balcony for a long time, watching the lights of the city flicker in the distance. Somewhere below, life went on. People moved through their daily routines, believing in choice, believing in randomness. They didn't know the game was already decided. They never would. I reached into my pocket, fingers brushing against the folded piece of paper, the first message, the first warning. We were here before you. I exhaled slowly, realizing something I hadn't before. They weren't just saying they had come before me. They were saying they would be here after me, too. Long after this moment. Long after I was gone. They had always been here. And they always would be.